Let's continue our installation. So now we're looking at the name service selection screen. Within Sun Solaris, name service selection is very, very important. And here are the options that are provided to us: NIS Plus and NIS Plus being the later of the two, DNS and LDAP, or none. So it is optional. You may not have a name service such as LDAP, DNS, or NIS Plus configured on your network, and as a result, select the none option. In our case, we're using DNS as the name service, so we're going to go ahead and select DNS. We have a DNS server, and actually we have multiple DNS servers, and we'll be specifying their IP addresses for resolution. Each of those DNS servers should have a host name and optionally, but advisably, a reverse address for the server that you're configuring. So in this case, we've labeled the server as linuxcbt sun1.linuxcbt.internal. Perhaps you should configure your DNS environment to match what we're going to configure this particular host. In other words, create a record. Create an A record as well as a reverse PTR record for the Solaris host so that when it queries DNS, it finds itself. Otherwise, you can always do it later on. Upon each reboot or restart of the network services within Solaris, it'll query the DNS server to see if any information has been determined. So DNS is our name service of choice. Let's F2 to continue. We'll need to specify a domain name. The domain name in this case is called linuxcbt.internal, and this is a domain that Solaris will search on the DNS server for a record which matches the host name that we configured earlier, which is linuxcbt sun1. So keep that in mind. Your DNS server should be configured appropriately, but it's not critical if you don't get DNS right during installation. As long as you have an IP address that's able to communicate both on your local subnet as well as via the default gateway, you should be able to communicate and get things squared away once the system's up and running. So this is by no means a showstopper to your installation. Let's F2 to continue, and here we specify up to 3 DNS servers. We can, once the system's up and running, change the resolve.conf file or the default file which houses the DNS servers to include additional DNS servers, but the installation screen limits us to 3 DNS servers. We mentioned that we have 2 DNS servers, or a couple DNS servers in our network, and their IP addresses are as follows: 192.168.1.100, that's a default DNS server. And there's yet another DNS server located at 168.1.10. So we have 2 DNS servers which will provide us with name resolution for getting access to hosts on our local network as well as on the internet. We'll F2 to continue. We don't have a third server to configure. And we can optionally configure search domains. Whenever applications that are attempting to resolve DNS names to IP addresses are run on the local Solaris system execute, they will search these default search domains first prior to querying additional DNS servers. So in other words, if we specify a search domain of linuxcbt.internal and then make a request from the web browser once the Solaris system's up, or from a utility such as wget or SSH, or any utility that makes use of name resolution services, DNS name resolution services, without a suffix. So if we were to search, let's say there's another box on the network called linuxcbt sun2, we can make a call to linuxcbt sun2 without specifying the long suffix of linuxcbt.internal, and the DNS resolver will take care of appending the suffix of linuxcbt.internal for us. So we can make calls to servers using their short names instead of their fully qualified domain names. If there are multiple search domains within your environment, specify them. Many companies have many aliases. Many are used both inside and outside of those organizations. So for example, internally our domain is linuxcbt.internal, but externally it's linuxcbt.com. We may have another test domain, linuxcbt.int, or external, or test, or any suffix that we imagine we may have configured within our corporation and may want to enable this short name feature for those domains as well. So basically, the more search domains you configure, the more the DNS resolver on the Solaris box will attempt to resolve a short name to one of the domains, the more effort it makes. The fewer domains, the less effort it makes. because it'll query fewer domains. It'll do less appending of suffixes, in this case domain suffixes. F2 to continue, and we'll need to confirm that this is the DNS configuration on the network, and it is. We have no problems with this information. And usually when Solaris attempts to confirm the DNS information, it'll throw an error if your DNS is not properly configured, including A records and PTR records for the host that you're setting up. So be sure to set up your DNS properly, or after you have the system up and running, configure it thereafter. We can specify time zone information. Since we are located in the Americas, that is, we'll simply specify it using spacebar followed by F2 to continue, and then only the countries within the Americas are displayed on the following screen. We're in the United States, so we'll F2 to continue, but there are many other countries that are located within the Western Hemisphere, or at least within the Americas, that you can select from to match your region, which of course affects the daylight savings time functionality of your clock or the operating system's clock. So be sure to specify the proper country and the proper region so that the rules are applied properly. In other words, you don't want to be an hour ahead while everyone else is an hour behind. F2 to continue, and we can be even more specific. Since the United States spans multiple time zones, we'll go ahead and specify Eastern Time since we're located within the Eastern Time Zone, and this really equates to GMT minus 5 as an offset. So our current time is currently set to, including date information, 2006-04-26-1814. This looks accurate. We'll have F2 to continue. It's Eastern U.S. time. This can all be changed, so don't worry about committing anything to stone from the installation program. It can all be changed, obviously. But if you do need to change it, simply press F4, and that'll allow you to make the change. We'll F2 to continue. We're now at the stage where we should specify root's password. We're going to go ahead and specify a simple password of ABC123 and press F2 to continue. And you'll notice that the installer doesn't complain about the lack of complexity of the password, such as the lack of upper and or mixed cases and characters. Super. Now we're at a screen where the Solaris interactive installation begins. It tells us the following screens will be able to accept defaults. We can customize the system. Defaults pertaining to packages and partitioning. So we've given the system all of the key pieces of information it needs to get on the network and be a productive member of your networked environment. Now we need to specify software packages and file system layouts. This is pretty much the heart of the installation that we're entering, since for any host, it'll contain n number of packages and will contain various layouts for the file system that will suit the purpose of the system. For a server class system, you may want to lay out multiple file systems carefully, and you may want to do so prior to actually installing the software, such as separating var, where variable data is stored, from opt, where software is stored, from etc, where configuration files are stored, and so on. For a basic desktop or power workstation, you may want to go with the automatic file system layout, which creates two file systems for us, one root and one swap. Either way, we can make the changes coming up in subsequent screens. You'll also notice that there's a flash option below, the F4 option. Solaris can be installed from flash images. In the event that you need to deploy Solaris 10 on multiple identical systems, you may set up one system as the master system and create a flash archive based on that system and create installations for subsequent systems based on the flash archives. In other words, you can automate the subsequent installations of systems that are identical to save you from having to specify the prompts, the software groups, as well as the file system layout. We'll F2 to standard, which just takes us to the standard installation. And here we're prompted for what Solaris should do once it reboots the system. Should it eject the CD or not? Depending on how your BIOS works, you'll want to make that determination. In our case, we will want to have Solaris automatically eject the CD when it's either time for a new CD or time to reboot the system. Otherwise, we run the risk of having the installer rerun, causing us to waste a lot of time. So if you're in an environment where the BIOS for the system that you're configuring will not bypass the CD-ROM or wait for user input or prompt the user for input within a given time range before actually booting from the CD-ROM, then consider having the Solaris installer automatically eject the CD. Again, if you don't have it automatically eject the CD, the system will be rebooted after a certain point in the installation, and since the CD-ROM is set to the default boot device, it'll cause the CD-ROM to boot again, which will take us back to the grub menu and present us with the options to install Solaris, which is not what we want when we move into phase 2, which is basically to boot the system. So F2 to continue, but we do have the ability to manually eject. And notice that we now do have the ability to go back, F3 to effect changes. We'll F2, and here we're prompted with a similar option to the automatic eject of the disk, but in this case it's the automatic reboot. In some instances you may want, when the installer is finished, for it to wait for user input or for the user to make a decision. But in most cases, you're pressed for time, you'll want Solaris to automatically reboot the system and move on with the installation. Especially if you're installing from a remote location, perhaps through a console port. You wouldn't want it to wait for user input. Super. We'll F2 to continue, and let's see what we have in store for the next round of options. Now it notices that the system is upgradable. The reason why it notices that it's upgradable is because there is a version of Solaris installed on the server already. When the installer runs, the Solaris installer runs, it searches for, especially on in particularly on x86, it searches for an x86 fdisk partition or a Solaris fdisk partition. If it finds an fdisk partition, and only one can exist on your x86 box, you can have 4 partitions on any disk on an x86 box, that is, usually 3 primary and 1 extended, is the configuration that you're likely to see, but you can only have one Solaris fdisk. If the installer finds that fdisk, it knows that Solaris was previously installed on the system and provides you with the ability to upgrade the system. But in this case, we're going to skip the upgrade, so we're not going to select F2. We're going to go ahead and press F4 and which instructs the installer that this is an initial installation rather than an upgrade. So we want to skip the upgrade and go straight ahead to an initial install. This is the ideal way of installing for us. We'll just wait for the install media to be loaded. Right now, if you're following along, you'll notice that your CD or your DVD-ROM drive is reading. The package information and the various groups and settings are being read directly from the CD-ROM to be presented to us in this text-based interface. We'll have to accept the terms, and we'll press F2 to accept the license and the terms. We'll then need to specify the geographic region for which we should provide support. Now this is where we define locale information. So let's go ahead and find our North American region, and here we'll press spacebar, which expands the options for us, and we'll move over using the arrow key and then navigate to select the options that are applicable within the US. A simple UTF-8 will work, as well as ISO. Either or will work. English USA works, as well as UTF-8. We can install multiple locales. Locales affect, again, character information, the way information is displayed on the screen, the way it's read from the keyboard, and so on. So we'll go with both USA options, and we'll F2 to continue once the locales are installed. Now, again, the locales affect the running system. However, we were presented with the option to install Solaris using one of many languages, which is independent of the locales information. The locales information is for once the system's up and running. The default is POSIX C. If you want, you can change the default to any of the selected locales, but we'll stick with the default of POSIX. And now we're presented with additional installation options. Solaris is available on 4 CDs, or Solaris 10, that is, 106, is available on 4 CDs and optionally 1 DVD, and there is a companion DVD that it comes with, which contains additional software, primarily open source software. If you want, you can install that additional software. You may also download the documentation CD or DVD and install that as well. So you can install all that information on your system. Now if you do expand each of these options, you'll see what software is presented. So what we'll do next is break down the packages that are available for our installation.